As life evolved, each species through its metabolic process, aided by sedimentation and sequestration, cleaned up this toxic place that Earth was in the beginning. And out of that process emerged an Earth sweet enough that even we could evolve into it and survive. It was a process that took 3.85 billion years. And in just a heartbeat, a flick of an eye, we reversed that process. The industrial age has turned the Earth's crust upside down and brought that stuff in whose presence we could never have evolved right back into our very living room. That's madness.
We're the only species that digs up the Earth's crust and then turns it into toxic waste. How are other organisms meeting their needs? And has anyone ever thought of asking them for advice? In a book I wrote called Biomimicry, I met people who are doing just that. Biomimicry is the process of learning from and then emulating life's genius. After 3.8 billion years, life knows what works and what lasts here on Earth. Mimicking these designs and strategies, their recipes, could change the way we grow food, harness solar energy, run our businesses, even the way we make materials. For instance, if we're not going to raid the Earth's crust, what will we use? Life might use something that grows and then decomposes, something we could farm instead of mine. But then we'd have to change our farming so it's not the factory that it is today, but something more like a natural system. I met a man named Wes Jackson, and he's thinking this way. He spent a lifetime studying the genius of his place, the tallgrass prairie.
I love my place more than I love all the Rocky Mountains, more than I love the whole world. It has to do with the intimacy, the connection. And if you have that connection and stay put long enough and get to know a place long enough, then it's the place where you are and that you're taken care of. And ultimately, the care of our earth is our oldest job. When we Europeans came, we came as a poor people to a seemingly empty land that was rich. We saw it as an inexhaustible reservoir. There's talk about the endless forests and the endless prairies. Our ancestors looked at the prairie as something to plow under. They thought that they were meeting some kind of a larger purpose, so it was a matter of development. We essentially believed that we could do better than nature. And we didn't see that here were systems that had evolved in place over the millennia, a system that featured material recycling and ran on contemporary sunlight. We didn't see this place for what it was so much as for what it could become.
We saw the land and its creatures as resources to exploit as quickly as possible. We plowed the prairie to plant row crops. In the process, we turned a rich natural system into one that bleeds soil, poisons water, and harms communities, an industrial waste zone.
Let's take north central Iowa, area that extends up into Minnesota and Canada, this area that the glaciers last visited about 12,000 years ago. That landscape is about as heavily farmed as you can possibly imagine. This area is really a sacrifice zone. There's nothing left. Iowa now has 1/10 of 1% of its prairies intact. This is a state that was once 85% prairie.
We plant monocultures, fields of one crop like wheat or corn. They rely heavily on oil-based inputs, from equipment fuel to natural gas fertilizers to petroleum-based pesticides. And although we're using more pesticides than ever, we're losing the battle with pests and poisoning ourselves in the process. Consider the fact that popular pesticides like atrazine are now common in wells on family farms.
If we step outside the system that's feeding us and look at what's doing it, we see that it cannot go on, that it's dependent upon extractive forces, and that we better think about how to be husbanding that soil. Soil is the key. Soil is really the mother of all land life.
There are 5,000 species of microorganisms in a single teaspoon of soil, tunneling, eating, excreting, sweetening the soil crumb by crumb.
There's an incredible ignorance about soil. It's actually alive. Well, the industrial mind just looks at it as something that you put your inputs into and as a way to hold the plant, and then we'll harvest it.
Our grain crops are annuals, which means we lay bare the soil each spring for planting. After harvest, the soil is exposed once again to water and wind erosion. In 100 years of growing annual crops, we've lost a third of our topsoil and a staggering 1/2 of our soil fertility. Of topsoil that took thousands of years to form are simply washed or blown away.
What I appreciate is that the folks at the Land Institute didn't stop with just identifying the problems of agriculture. They took the next step to come up with a compelling alternative. They said to themselves, what will work here? And then they took that biomimetic step and said, what is already working here? What would nature be doing here if we didn't have our wheat fields here in western Kansas? And the answer was the tallgrass prairie. And they began to perfect the art of conversation and the art of inquiry to a whole natural system.
So coming into what we call a conversation with the prairie is very important in gaining enough understanding of these systems that we can bring our agricultural systems closer to these systems. And by conversation, I mean, number one, being out here and seeing what's going on over a long period of time. Seeing from one year to the next the changes in the prairie. It's not a static system, it's very dynamic. From one part of the season to the next, and from definitely over a period of years. Some of the constants, however, being diversity, the perennial root systems, and the high productivity.
Anchoring the high productivity of the prairie is a dense year-round root system. By comparison, our annual plants have small seasonal roots, incapable of absorbing nutrients throughout the year.
Okay, here is a soybean plant that I just dug up. It's a little bit deceptive, this prairie section, because the roots can go down several meters. Whereas here, it won't be until later, till near maturity, that this root system is of any significant size. We can picture any rain falling on this prairie system being taken up somewhere along the way by this dense network of roots. Whereas for this soybean plant, it's very likely to miss most of the water, miss most of the nutrients. That's why we have to put so many nutrients and so much energy into producing these plants. Similarly with corn, similarly with wheat. So very inefficient systems. This prairie system very conservative and self-sustaining.
When you look at perennial roots, it seems like such an obvious way to grow crops. The plant's in the ground all year long. They're ready to go in the spring, and they catch lots of water and nutrients. So why aren't our crops perennial? It turns out that conventional wisdom got in the way. Conventional wisdom holds that a plant has only so much energy to go around. If it puts it into growing roots, it won't have many seeds. So this trade-off theory caused people to believe we couldn't breed perennialism, or big roots, and still have lots of seeds. So we stayed with annuals.
But then Laura Jackson noticed a plant called eastern gamma grass that was flying in the face of that theory. It was during a visit to a research plot in Oklahoma where scientists were growing perennial gamma grass for forage production.
They had normal plants with the normal amount of seeds and pollen, and then they had these high-yielding, high-seed production plants right next to them in the same fields. And we walked out in those fields, and I asked the plant breeder, "Are they different?" And he said, "No." I said, "Do they end up dying quicker? Are they shorter lived?" He said, "No." "Do they get more diseases? Are they more susceptible to water stress? You know, what's wrong with them?" He said, "Nothing. They're fine." In fact, he said, this Oklahoman Chet D. Wald, he said, "Laura, sex don't cost, it pays." So I thought, well, this is somebody with an open mind who had not read the trade-off literature and didn't have a preconceived notion about what things could and couldn't do. He just saw the grass and he worked with it.
The conventional wisdom was that you couldn't breed perennialism back into crops, and it was so ingrained in the scientific community as a belief that it was actually pretty high risk, for instance, to tell your graduate student to go into this.
Other graduate students and faculty were very skeptical that I would find anything because of a preconceived notion that this was basically impossible. So that meant trying to figure that out.
Over the next several years, Laura studied the plant to see if increasing its seed yield would mean a decrease in the number or size of perennial roots. She wanted to prove or disprove the famous trade-off rule.
What we found is we could get seed increase with no trade-off. So that grass seed stalk that waves in the wind, it's green, it's got leaves, it's a benefit to the plant. It is a net carbon exporter. It is taking energy from the sun, fixing it into sugars, it's producing seeds, and it's also moving some of those sugars to the rest of the plant when it's under stress.
Land Institute scientists are replacing conventional wisdom with gratitude for the place-based wisdom of the prairie.
My affection for the prairie comes from actually being out here on it, having grown up on a farm and seeing all the nutrients that you have to supply to an agricultural field to get the crop production that you need. And then coming here on the prairie, seeing that productivity is self-maintained.
But what fuels this productivity? For 7 consecutive summers, they clipped and cataloged all the plants in nearby prairies. To their surprise, the dizzying variety of species fell into just 4 functional groups.
Well, this little prairie bouquet nicely illustrates what we're talking about when we talk about 4 functional groups. Over here we have a warm season grass, eastern gamma grass. Here we have a sunflower family member in bloom. Here is our cat's claw sensitive briar, the legume. And here we have June grass, a cool season grass.
There are hundreds of species in this prairie. And within that diversity, you find only those 4 types. That's a deep pattern. And what Wes Jackson said was, I'm not sure why that works, but I'm going to go with that.
Whether we're talking about the Canadian provinces or shortgrass prairie and the Great Plains or all the way into Ohio, it has those 4 functional groups. warm season grasses, cool season grasses, legumes, members of the sunflower family. Our idea is to try to mimic that structure in order to be granted the functions.
How come they changed that?
Well, we're working to perennialize wheat and rye and sorghum and sunflowers, and if we had more people, why, corn and the major crops, and put them in mixtures that would mimic the vegetative structure of this prairie.
By breeding annual plants with their perennial relatives, Land Institute scientists want to reintroduce perennialism back into the major crops. Their 20-year goal is to create not one variety, but a whole perennial germplasm, which will allow farmers to adapt these varieties to their local conditions.
One of the lines that Wes has used for many years is that we're working on the problem of agriculture as opposed to problems in agriculture. And that's the thing that keeps us going.
We will need more eyes per acre in the kind of agriculture that would be a derivative of looking at the prairie. But it would be a mind more like that of a 19th century British naturalist than the modern day dirt farmer. It would be what Wendell Berry has called a conversation with nature. If you can have an affection for nature that is not a kind of cheap nostalgia, an affection that then informs the possibility of a conversation.
Wes Jackson believes that the best way to mimic a prairie is to develop an affection for it. And out of this will come an understanding of how we might grow not only our crops, but the raw material for a new generation of products that will not build up in a landfill, but will instead break down to help gardens grow. Every second of every day, the sun's energy pours onto the planet, enough to meet all of life's needs. Plants capture that energy in a process called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis supplies all of our energy needs too, even fossil fuels. The gas in your tank is ancient sunlight, captured 65 million years ago in the bodies of plants and animals. But when we burn the product of that ancient photosynthesis, we release too much carbon dioxide for the atmosphere to handle. But current photosynthesis has great promise. If we could do what a plant does, which is lasso solar energy, we could use it to do our chemistry or to make our materials. If our solar harvesters were as small and ubiquitous as those in a leaf, we could embed them in the skin of our buildings or lay them on our highways. But first, we'd have to learn, how does nature pack such a powerful idea into such a small package? And then, with the plant's help, we could try to mimic it.
Well, if you think about the processes in biology, photosynthesis is certainly, in many respects, the most important as far as the ecosystem of the Earth is concerned. Anytime you look at what goes on in biology and you see how well it works and how complicated the systems are, that you have to be somewhat in awe. One of the things that's appealed to me in this area is the opportunity to learn how to use light for various purposes and learn from organisms that already know how to do it, because plants have figured out how to do this over several billion years, and why should we go out and try to reinvent the wheel? We can learn from those plants how to do photosynthesis ourselves, maybe, and then adapt those principles for our own purposes.
When I am in Arizona, and that is where I work most of the time, I ride the bicycle to work. It's actually a very nice time. It's a desert park. Frequently, when I'm riding the bicycle, I'm planning some experiments in the laboratory. And I am thinking of how I'm going to carry out this reaction, what I'm going to build. The molecules of nature are fantastic. I think that to look at the saguaro cactus and the creosote bushes and all these desert plants are almost like an inspiration because I know that they are doing exactly what I want to do in the test tube.
When I see a leaf, I'm afraid I think more of the chemistry that's going on in the leaf. And maybe I miss some beauty of the leaf, but it's a beauty that, it's the kind of beauty that I see anyway. And I think that as I think of the chemistry that goes on in the leaf at this point, I admire it. I'm in awe that these things can go on and that they work. Essentially, all life on the planet is a consequence of photosynthesis.
When they met 20 years ago, Devens Goost and Anna and Tom Moore were each studying the molecules that transfer the sun's energy to the photosynthetic reaction center. Exactly how leaves collected sunlight was still a mystery.
The three of us were all starting out. We used to eat lunch together quite a bit, and we decided over lunch one day, well, maybe instead of studying these very complicated natural systems, maybe we'd try to instead make some simpler ones synthetically and try to abstract from those natural systems the basic principles and see if we could reproduce them in an artificial system. And that really got us started in this business.
Their inspiration was a cyanobacterium, one of the oldest living organisms. 3.5 billion years ago, they invented photosynthesis and began releasing oxygen, making it possible for air breathers like us to evolve.
We took as a model not the photosynthesis in green plants, which everybody's familiar with, but rather that in bacteria. Now, the photosynthesis that happens in bacteria is somewhat simpler. It's still closely related to what happens in plants, and easier, we thought, to try to take as a model.
Opposites attract. Positive and negative charges are drawn together. It takes energy to pull them apart across a membrane. And in a bacteria or a leaf, that's how the sun's energy is stored. The bacteria uses that energy to make fuel, a chemical compound called ATP. Now, their challenge was to keep those charges separated for as long as the bacteria could. And at this point, several teams of scientists around the world were trying.
Photosynthesis was able to make these charge-separated states live a long time and live long enough to harvest the energy stored in them. And yet these artificial systems didn't do that. None of them were able to do that.
Getting molecules to hook up often requires many reactions, and building a single new molecule can take years, so it helps if you're tenacious.
I remember that when I was young and I was in the laboratory and I will run a reaction, if something didn't go in the way that I wanted, it will inspire me to work even harder, and to just go back and try it again, and go to another page and try a different recipe until you get what you want.
Why do we need this spectrum? In a way, we're cowards in that we don't try to do things where we don't know if it's even possible to do them. I know it's possible to do this because it's going on right outside the window.
And we were thinking about this problem, and we decided to try to increase the lifetime of this charge separation using a trick that we thought was used by photosynthesis.
They thought that in photosynthesis the charge separation was prolonged because the electron didn't cross the membrane all at once, but had to hop along a series of molecules. Based on that guess, they decided to add a third hop, another molecule to their reaction center. So, in the summer of '82, like previous summers, they all packed up their families and molecules in progress to continue their work in France.
I was working in the Museum of Natural History in the center of Paris, and I was in charge at the time of the synthesis of the molecule. And Tom and Devens were going to study this molecule in a different laboratory, that is in Saclay, that is in the south of Paris. And it was an enormously complicated operation, because to go from the Museum of Natural History to home, I needed to take of the order of 5 subways with the children to pick them up from the school and so on, and carry physically the molecule in flasks in my purse. As you can see, those molecules are pretty stable. And arrive home after the 5 subways, and then we keep them in the freezer. Tom took the molecule to Saclay, and they started to do the laser spectroscopy. And he called me from his lab, and he told me, you know, I think that we have it, but we don't know for sure. And then they went back and worked, and after 2 hours, called me back again, and he said, it's not any doubt. It really does function.
I can remember very well seeing the trace on the oscilloscope that showed the long lifetime for that charge-separated state, and that was a very exciting thing for all of us, because we knew we'd really done something novel and different at that point. Before, that was just a hope.
When we are building molecules and they are going to do something, to wait and find out what they are actually doing is one of the most exciting things, you know. Just to build a molecule to build it is not fun, you know. I mean, it's good, the recipe function, and that is okay, but to see that the molecule is actually doing what you want, I think it's very challenging, and it's very, very exciting.
We do 10 experiments that don't work for every one that does work. And we learn from the 10. Sometimes we learn more from the experiments that don't work than we do from the ones that do work. But you do need to keep trying. So I think the failures make the successes all that much better.
Next, the team dreamt of storing the energy they had trapped in a useful form. What cells use is a molecule called ATP. When cells need energy to move, multiply, or metabolize, they tap into ATP molecules by the billions.
So now they had a 3-part molecule with a long charge separation. They wanted to do what the bacteria does, which is use that stored energy to make ATP. But in the bacteria, the reaction center is embedded in a membrane, sort of a skin. So they made an artificial membrane, like a soap bubble, embedded the power pack in that, and when hit by light, the charges separate and the stored energy is used to turn ADP into ATP, which is the fuel of life.
We found that when we shine light on that system, it did the whole thing. It got all the way from light absorption to making ATP. That was, again, a very exciting thing, because that was, in a sense, the culmination of this program, which had been going on for over 20 years, of trying to mimic what goes on those bacterial reaction centers.
Mimicking photosynthesis points to a day when we may use sunlight instead of fossil fuels to make pharmaceuticals and to do our chemistry. To do chemistry in water and without waste, nature uses enzymes. Enzymes have shaped pockets that grab certain molecules and bring them together to react. Biomimics are awed by how well this works and have looked for ways to mimic it. James Gillette has created an artificial enzyme, a photozyme, that mimics the light-gathering antennae in leaves. It shuttles the sun's energy to a central location where it can make and break chemical bonds.
What we have been doing to study this is to try to build our own antennas to do chemistry. And we have used them to make imitation enzymes, not to do what nature does, but to do other reactions that we want to do with light. The key to biological chemistry is the extreme specificity that you can build into enzymes. Water forms the enzyme into the specific structure which will attract only one material into the center of it and react with it. It won't, because of the fact that these structures are very selective, you can now do very selective chemistry, and it's so selective that you can get 100% yields. For example, there has been some concern about things called PCBs, which are chlorinated hydrocarbons and which have toxic effects. We can make a photozyme that dissolves in water, and these PCBs would much rather be in the center of our photozyme than out in the water, so they come in. In the presence of light, you can dechlorinate the molecule and detoxify it. It goes in as a polymer, as a solid, and it dissolves in the water. And then when the sun comes up, it starts to decompose the stuff. And in a week or so, all the toxic material has been detoxified. We're at the very beginning of probably the most exciting age of chemistry, I think, ever.
It's exciting to think how far we've come in mimicking photosynthesis until you realize that the blue-green algae invented this process over 3 billion years ago. So if we continue our conversation with the Earth's chlorophylled and single-celled, they might just teach us a better way to make materials, using not fossil fuels from ancient sunlight, but the current sunlight that streams so generously to Earth. Biomimicry is about asking, what would nature do here? Well, we've got two problems. Too many plastics in landfills and too much carbon dioxide. What would nature do here? We're the only species that would look at a free, abundant resource and say carbon dioxide, bad. Most organisms would say it's free, it's local, it's abundant, carbon dioxide, good, and they'd find a way to use it. Which plants do? They use it to make sugars. But there's too much carbon dioxide for them to handle. So why don't we become more plant-like and use the excess carbon dioxide to make a biodegradable plastic?
Plants use carbon dioxide, their main source of carbon, to produce 100 billion tons of cellulose every year. What do they know that we don't?
You might expect that if it's the sole source of carbon for nature, the chemist must also use it. The amazing thing is that very few chemists use CO2 in any reaction, especially a catalytic reaction. The problem is CO2 is very unreactive, and what makes it a challenge to use this as a chemical feedstock is that chemists like to use molecules that have a lot of energy that, for example, they combust easily. And that's why things like petroleum are such good feedstocks ultimately for making chemicals. They have all this potential energy. Whereas carbon dioxide, the fact that it's everywhere and it's very non-flammable, that's a good indication that it's not very reactive. So the real quest here is to find ways to make CO2 more reactive and actually incorporate that into a chemical reaction.
What Jeff Coates needs to find is a catalyst that makes carbon dioxide more reactive. This challenge happens to be one of the holy grails of chemistry. Most recently, the company pulled the plug on its efforts after spending 10 years and $10 million.
Finding a new catalyst is, in some cases, a little bit like playing the lottery. If you say you're going to play the lottery and win, most people think you're crazy. Discovering catalysts, obviously we have a little bit better odds of discovering a catalyst and winning the lottery, but in many cases you'll make something that you think should be a catalyst and it does absolutely nothing.
The third player in the reaction is a molecule called an epoxide that's very eager to react with carbon dioxide.
And this one I added.
We're taking another molecule, a very reactive molecule, known as an epoxide. That's really the energetic driving force for the reaction. and by taking a very reactive molecule and a very unreactive molecule, carbon dioxide. You put the two together to overall have enough energy to push the reaction forward.
I'm going to shake it one more time to make sure we get all the catalyst down there.
We develop catalysts that take these two molecules, hook them together, kind of like beads on a string in this alternated fashion. What makes our chemistry special is the rate at which the catalyst does this. A typical polymer chain might have 1,000 units in it, and the old catalyst would put these units together at a rate of about 1 per hour. What our catalyst is very special at doing is putting these together extremely rapidly. Some of our turnover frequencies are between 1 and 2,000 per hour. And so instead of going from days or weeks, we can actually have reactions that take place in a matter of minutes or hours.
To make his plastic totally green, Coates has now found a renewable epoxide. Instead of using petroleum, he's using a substance from the peel of an orange.
By asking, what do plants do? We solved two problems. We got biodegradable plastics, and we got rid of a greenhouse gas. It's what Wendell Berry calls solving for pattern, finding one solution that solves many problems without creating a new one. But Coates didn't stop there. He found a bacteria that makes a natural biodegradable plastic. And he thought, could we borrow that recipe too?
Had nature not made this plastic, of which we know the structure, we as chemists would not necessarily have quickly gone to this important target. So nature made this plastic, scientists isolated it. They said, they were able to look at the properties and say, what an amazing material, if we could only make it in a more economically and environmentally responsible manner.
Others made this plastic by farming the bacteria and extracting their product using toxic solvents. Instead, said Coates, let's use the bacteria's recipe and make the plastic ourselves.
So what we're doing in my lab is we're trying to find a chemical route using cheap commodity everyday chemicals into making this plastic that occurs in nature. And so we're actually using carbon monoxide, which is effectively a renewable resource, as one of the reagents to make this plastic. So this is the polyhydroxybutyrate. We just had to precipitate it out from the solution. So one of the really attractive features is you can actually biodegrade these. You can dig a hole in the earth, you can bury them, bacteria will degrade these all the way back into carbon dioxide, so to really complete the life cycle. Even better would be to revert it back to the small molecule that you can repolymerize for the simple fact that you're using much less energy to make a plastic than if you take it all the way back to carbon dioxide and have to regenerate it from the start.
We've seen how nature's ideas can help us take a pollutant and turn it into a biodegradable plastic. But our problems go deeper than just one product. It's the whole system, the way we make and deliver things. So is there anything in nature that business could learn to emulate? Some people think we already are emulating a type 1 system. Weeds. They move into a field, use the resources, and move on. In our overused world, the better strategy is a type 3 system, a mature forest. It stays put, so it has to learn to recycle everything. Some companies are starting to make this shift from type 1 to type 3, especially those that realize that a type 1 strategy won't last.
Biomimicry would teach a different system that was not extractive and not abusive, but was renewable and benign. It would teach a system that used the sun for energy instead of the stored sunlight from 3 billion years ago, fossil fuels. It would teach a system where cooperation prevailed instead of competition and confrontation.
Ray Anderson is using the forest as a model in order to make his company restorative.
A restorative company, by our definition at Interface, is a company that puts back more than it takes and does good to the earth, not just no harm.
In this carpet mill, there is no such thing as waste. yarn is treated as gold, and every bit is recycled into new product to keep the energy that went into making the yarn from being wasted. To eliminate toxic discharges from dyes, they use tufters to create color designs. Waste reduction also led to the use of portable creels that deliver only the amount of yarn needed for an order. But to find even more radical savings, they're asking themselves, how would nature make a carpet?
It was what we could learn, not copy from nature. Or how would nature design a carpet tile? And after a period of just looking at natural flaws outside, we had leaves on the ground and the stones, the rocks. One thing that came up, it was diversity. Nothing was the same. There was no perfection in nature. How would you make each tile to come out slightly different in color and design? That was the challenge.
Their nature-inspired design was beautiful, eliminated all waste, and was a hit.
From that came all the positives that could be laid random, just like leaves or stone. We didn't even think about that while we were designing the process.
Next, Ray Anderson is taking the company beyond mimicking the designs from the forest floor to mimicking the forest's recycling program.
We hope to mine the landfills and take all of yesteryear's carpets and textiles and other polymeric materials and make them the feedstock for our factories of the future. And then we will turn to natural products, renewable products as a source of fiber and polymeric materials.
And he's looking at how Jeff Coates is using carbon dioxide to make polymers. Could carbon dioxide be a feedstock to make carpets?
To turn to a waste product, if you will, and use it for food. Why not? And if we can figure out how to put them together in the right configuration from such sources as carbon dioxide and water, what a deal. Out of our culture, we've acquired the notion that the earth belongs to us, to humankind. It's ours to do with as we wish, ours to conquer. The earth is limited and we have to treat it with respect. Good people should see that. But we do have to somehow deal with the culture that continues, as Daniel Quinn says, to whisper in our ear, it's yours to do with as you wish.
Clearly, we've got to have a different kind of economic system rather than a system on how to maintain the well rather than how to build a better pump. And that's how to build a better pump is what capitalism is all about, and it's an extractive approach.
So we have a system today that's totally at war with nature, continuing to use nature, extracting from nature to create wealth.
You can't imagine what we do to the planet to hold up our underwear. Materials like Lycra, they start off with things like acetylene and formaldehyde. And then you put rare earth metal catalysts with them, handle them very gingerly because they'll just explode on their own. Then you put 6,000 pounds per square inch of hydrogen, forcing hydrogen into this molecule. Then you douse it with hydrofluoric acid, and it gets so gunky you can't see through it, so you have to use radioactive leveling devices to find out how much junk is in the vessel. And that's just how you start the process of making Lycra. So can you imagine doing that process in the conditions conducive for life?
I'm absolutely certain that business must be part of the solution to the problem. It is the major part of the problem today, and it must become a major part of the solution to the problem. We can't, without business and industry coming aboard and changing course, it's over. It's just a matter of time.
Interface is the largest producer of commercial floor coverings in the world. Anderson recalls when the seed of sustainability took root.
It was our customers who started us on this in the first place by asking questions way back in 1994, what's your company doing for the environment? And we couldn't give them a decent answer. And a task force was assembled to assess our company's worldwide environmental position. It was just when I was sweating with what to say to those people that Paul Hawkins' book, The Ecology of Commerce, landed on my desk, and I began to read it, and it became that spear in the chest experience, that epiphanal experience.
A lot what was happening still is, but with respect to business was problem statements. In other words, we have a problem. And so there was a long period of trying to make people aware of what the problem was and is. And that's kind of a bummer. It is. I mean, it's not a happy thing. It's gloomy. It isn't humankind at their best. And there doesn't seem to be a ready way out.
We started the process to unravel 3.8 billion years of evolution. And it's the abusive industrial system that is at the heart of that unraveling, that destructive, voracious, consuming process. And it must change.
During Ray Anderson's first speech, that first day, somewhere around 10:15 a.m., August 31st, 1994, give or take a minute or two, everything that I'd learned about was completely called into question. And I saw there was something fundamentally wrong, but I didn't yet have anything to replace it with. It put me in a state of depression. I had trouble getting up in the morning, getting to work, because the problems seemed, every day I'd learned something that was bigger and worse than I'd learned the day before. So you almost didn't even want to go in to work or read that next chapter of that next book, because it just seemed like every time you took another step, it got worse.
But the interesting thing about the problems is that, from my point of view, it's only those people who take on the problem statement that really can see what the solutions should be. Like Hillman says, the gold is in the shadows, right? And so what biomimicry did was, it was a counterpoint to the problem statement, because it is, in effect, the manual for the solution statement. You couldn't not read the book and not have, these experiences of like, oh my gosh, well, yes, and if they can do that, well, why can't, there was a sense of cascading, opening of possibilities, and that's really the jewel, the gem that lies within the problem statement of sustainability, is that it actually leads through. If you keep going into the problem, everything opens up.
Any company that truly looks into sustainability and wants to function more like a living system than like a machine is going to be drawn to the model of sustainability on the landscape, which is a mature forest or a mature prairie or a coral reef. Something that, because it's not going anywhere, has to learn to take what it has and make the most of it. Make more and more and more opportunities for life without importing more materials, without exporting any wastes. Simply recycling what's there in new ways, using the energy of the sunlight, creating more and more life, and exchanging the building blocks that are right there.
This is interesting work, and what else is there to do? There's nothing better to do. I certainly don't want to go sell insurance. And it also, I believe in it being very important. I think it has a potential to increase our imagination about possibilities.
There is a hunger for us to be reconnected and for us to remember how to ask nature for help. My sense is that as biological beings, if we were to admit to ourselves that on this earth we have a certain set of opportunities and a certain set of limits, that the earth is abundant and resilient, but that she is not endlessly abundant and she is not endlessly resilient. And instead of bemoaning that fact and trying to push through those limits or overshoot what's given to us, that we learn to do what the other creatures have done, which is to dance within them and to become really, really creative about that. What biomimicry allows us to do is to fit in here, to come home,